Montana Territory, 1878. The last light of day painted the distant mountains in hues of purple and gold as Francis O'Malley guided his horse along the winding trail that led to his small ranch. At 26, he'd already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age, fought in skirmishes against rustlers, survived 2 brutal winters alone, and built his modest spread from nothing but raw determination and calloused hands. Francis dismounted at the hitching post outside his cabin, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. His sandy brown hair fell across his forehead as he gazed across the valley that stretched before his property. The young cowboy's lean, muscular frame showed the results of daily physical labor, his broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. Despite the rugged life he led, his face retained a youthful handsomeness with a strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Home, sweet home," he muttered to no one, his voice echoing in the emptiness around him. The words held no warmth. The cabin stood solid and well-built, a testament to his skill as a carpenter. Inside was clean and orderly, a pot of beans warming on the stove, a neat bunk in the corner, a table with a single chair. Everything a man needed to survive, nothing a man needed to live. Francis had built his existence on a simple truth: the frontier was no place for softness. Love and family were luxuries that got men killed in territory this wild. He'd seen it happen, watched good men make foolish choices because their hearts overruled their heads. He wouldn't make that mistake. Better to be alone than to watch someone you love suffer the harsh realities of frontier life. Better to guard your heart than to feel it break. Each night he ate his solitary meal, checked his ledgers, and slept with his revolver within arm's reach. This was the life he'd chosen, the life that made sense, the life that kept him alive. He told himself it was enough. The spring of 1878 had been unusually wet in this corner of the Montana Territory, turning the roads to mud and swelling the creek that bisected Francis's property. He had just returned from town with supplies when dark clouds began gathering on the horizon, promising another deluge. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he hurried to unload the wagon and secure his horses. The first fat raindrops were falling when he heard it, the sound of an approaching wagon, wheels struggling through the mud of the road that passed by his property. Francis frowned, hand instinctively moving to the revolver on his hip. Visitors were rare, especially in weather like this. He stepped onto his porch as the wagon came into view, lurching dangerously as one wheel slid into a deep rut. The driver, a young woman, he realized with surprise, fought to control the team of horses as they panicked in the worsening storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face for just an instant before the left wheel of the wagon broke with a sickening crack. Francis was running before he made the conscious decision to move, racing through the rain toward the tilting wagon. The woman cried out as the vehicle listed sharply, spilling her and her belongings into the mud. The frightened horses strained against their harnesses. "Hold on," Francis called, reaching the team and grabbing their bridles. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low and steady despite the thunder that crashed overhead. Once the horses had calmed, he hurried to where the woman was attempting to stand, her dress and coat covered in mud. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, offering his hand. She looked up, pushing sodden blonde hair from her face. Her eyes, a startling clear green, met his with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Only my pride, I think," she replied, accepting his assistance. As she stood, Francis noted she was tall for a woman, the top of her head reaching his chin. Despite the mud and dishevelment, he could see she was uncommonly beautiful, with delicate features and a determined set to her jaw. She couldn't be more than 20 years old. "I'm Abigail Connors," she said, raising her voice to be heard above the rain. "I was trying to reach Henderson Station before the storm hit." "You're about 15 miles short," Francis informed her, looking at the broken wagon. "And in no condition to continue today." Another flash of lightning, followed immediately by a thunderclap that made them both flinch, emphasized his point. "You can shelter at my place until the storm passes," he offered, gesturing toward his cabin. "We need to get these horses seen to, and your belongings are getting soaked." Gratitude flooded her face. "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley." Francis O'Malley. Together they unhitched the team and led them, along with Francis's own horses, into his small but sturdy barn. They worked quickly to salvage what they could from the wagon, a trunk, several parcels wrapped in oilcloth, and a carpet-bag that Abigail clutched protectively. By the time they reached the cabin, they were both drenched to the skin. Frances stoked the fire while Abigail stood awkwardly by the door, water pooling around her boots. "I'm afraid I don't have much in the way of women's clothes," Frances said, retrieving a clean shirt and pair of trousers from his chest. "But these will be dry, you can change behind that screen." He nodded toward a wooden folding screen in the corner, used for bathing. "Thank you, Mr. O'Malley," she said, accepting the clothes with a small, grateful smile that did something peculiar to Frances's chest. While she changed, he busied himself heating coffee and setting out bread and jerky, the best meal he could offer on short notice. When she emerged, his clothes hanging loosely on her frame, Frances found himself unaccountably flustered. He'd been alone so long that having another person in his space, a woman, no less, felt like an intrusion and a comfort all at once. "May I ask," Abigail began, settling into the chair he offered, "does anyone else live in your cabin, Mr. O'Malley?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Frances recognized the proper caution of a young woman finding herself alone with a strange man. "No," he answered honestly. "Just me." He saw relief and something else, perhaps disappointment, flicker across her face. "I see," she said quietly. Abigail took a sip of her coffee, studying him over the rim of her cup. "I should explain my situation," she continued. "I'm traveling to Henderson Station to take a position as the new schoolteacher. The town council arranged everything by mail." Frances nodded. He'd heard rumors that Henderson Station was growing enough to warrant a proper school. Long journey for a young woman alone. Her chin lifted slightly. "I'm 20 years old, Mr. O'Malley, old enough to make my own way. And after Boston, I find I need space." Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story, but Frances didn't pry. Everyone in the West had something they'd left behind. The storm showed no signs of abating as evening fell. Frances made up a bed for himself near the door, insisting Abigail take his bunk. Despite her protests, he was firm. "It wouldn't be right for me to take your bed," she argued. "And it wouldn't be right for me to let a lady sleep on the floor," he countered, his voice leaving no room for debate. "Besides, I've slept in worse places." In the darkness of the cabin, with rain drumming on the roof, Frances lay awake, acutely aware of his guest's presence. It had been years since he'd shared his space with anyone, and he found the experience unsettling. Not unpleasant, exactly, but a reminder of connections he'd deliberately avoided. Morning brought clear skies and a dilemma. Frances examined Abigail's wagon and confirmed what they both already knew: the broken wheel and axle would take days to repair, even if he had the right materials, which he didn't. "Henderson Station has a proper blacksmith," he explained as they stood beside the damaged vehicle, "but it's a day's ride and I can't leave you here alone." Abigail gnawed her lower lip, considering. "Could I ride with you to Henderson Station? I'm already late and the school term is supposed to begin next week." Frances hesitated. The idea of a day's ride with this woman pressed against his back made him uncomfortable for reasons he couldn't quite name. But he saw no alternative. "We'll leave tomorrow," he decided. "Today we'll secure your belongings and make preparations. The trail can be treacherous after rain." They spent the day working side by side, Abigail proving herself surprisingly capable for a city woman. She helped him move her trunk and packages to the shelter of his barn, assisted with the horses, and even prepared a stew for their evening meal that was far more flavorful than Frances's usual fare. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken when Abigail asked, "How long have you lived here, Mr. O'Malley?" "4 years," he answered, "built the cabin myself." "All alone?" He nodded, taking another bite of stew. "Don't you get lonely?" The question was direct, her green eyes searching his face with genuine curiosity. Frances set down his spoon. "Loneliness is safer than the alternative," he said, the words escaping before he could consider them. Abigail tilted her head. "What's the alternative?" "Loss," he replied simply. Seeing her confusion, he elaborated reluctantly. "Out here, people who rely on others get hurt. The frontier doesn't forgive weakness or sentiment." "Is that what you think love is, weakness?" Frances shifted uncomfortably. "I think it's a luxury most can't afford in territory this wild." Abigail studied him for a long moment. That's a rather bleak outlook for someone so young. I'm 26. Precisely my point, she said with a small smile, far too young to have given up on human connection. Frances changed the subject, asking about her teaching experience. For the rest of the evening, he listened as she spoke animatedly about her passion for education and her hopes for the school at Henderson Station. Despite himself, he found her enthusiasm infectious and her company not unwelcome. They departed early the next morning, Abigail seated behind Francis on his sturdy gelding, her arms encircling his waist. The proximity was as uncomfortable as he'd feared, but for entirely different reasons. Every time the horse's movement pressed her closer against him, Francis felt an unwelcome warmth spread through his chest. The journey to Henderson Station would take them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous territory in the region, across swollen streams, through narrow passes, and finally down into the valley where the growing settlement sprawled along the bank of the Henderson River. By midday, they stopped to rest in a small clearing. Francis helped Abigail dismount, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. She didn't seem to mind, smiling up at him with a warmth that made his stomach flip. "Thank you for doing this, Mr. O'Malley," she said, stretching her back. "I know it's an inconvenience." "Francis," he corrected, "if we're going to spend the day riding together, you might as well use my given name." Her smile widened. "Francis then, and you must call me Abigail." They shared a simple meal of jerky and biscuits, sitting closer than strictly necessary on a fallen log. As they ate, Francis found himself speaking more than he had in months, telling her about his small herd of cattle, his plans to expand his property, even sharing stories about the ornery mule that had helped him build his cabin before dying of old age the previous winter. "You sound like you loved that mule," Abigail observed. Francis shrugged. He was good company. "So you do admit that company is valuable," she teased, her eyes sparkling. Before he could respond, a distant sound caught his attention, hoofbeats approaching fast. In one fluid motion, Francis was on his feet, revolver drawn. "Get behind me," he ordered, all trace of warmth gone from his voice. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, rough-looking men with hard eyes that assessed the situation with predatory interest. The leader, a bearded man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, reined his horse to a stop. "Well now, what do we have here?" he drawled, gaze sliding from Francis to Abigail. "Mighty pretty company you're keeping, friend." Francis kept his revolver steady. "We're just passing through. Don't want any trouble." The scarred man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Trouble has a way of finding folks in these parts, especially folks carrying valuables. His eyes fixed on Abigail's carpetbag, which she'd kept close throughout their journey. "We have nothing of value," Francis stated flatly. "Move along." One of the other riders, a thin man with yellowed teeth, spat on the ground. "That's not for you to decide. Boss wants to see what the ladies got in that fancy bag." Francis felt Abigail tense behind him. "Whatever's in my bag is none of your concern," she said, her voice remarkably steady. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "Got spirit, doesn't she? Tell you what, hand over the bag and whatever money you're carrying and we'll let you continue on your way. Otherwise," he patted the rifle resting across his saddle. Francis knew they were outmatched. 3 against 1 with Abigail to protect, but he'd rather die than surrender her to these men. "Last chance to ride away," Francis warned, thumb drawing back the hammer of his revolver, the moment stretched taut as a wire. Then unexpectedly the scarred man laughed and raised his hands in mock surrender. "No need to be hasty, we're reasonable men," he glanced at his companions. "Perhaps we misread the situation. You folks have a safe journey now." With a tip of his hat that held more menace than courtesy, he wheeled his horse around. As the riders disappeared back into the trees, Francis remained tense, listening until the sound of hoofbeats faded. "They're gone," Abigail whispered, her hand gripping his arm. "For now," Francis replied grimly, holstering his weapon. "But they'll be back. We need to move fast and stay off the main trail." The encounter had changed everything. What should have been a straightforward journey had become a desperate race against men who would not hesitate to kill for whatever they believed Abigail carried. "What's in that bag that's so important?" Francis asked as they hurriedly packed their few supplies. Abigail clutched the carpetbag to her chest. "Letters," she answered, her voice low, "and a deed." A deed to what? She hesitated, then met his eyes squarely. To the Henderson mine. Francis stared at her. The Henderson mine was the reason Henderson Station existed at all, a silver strike that had brought prosperity to the region. The mine belongs to my uncle, Abigail explained quickly. He's been ill, and with no children of his own, he's leaving it to me. These men must have learned of his plans somehow. And you came all this way alone, carrying something that valuable. Francis couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. I didn't know, Abigail protested. Uncle Jacob sent for me to come teach at the school. The deed and his will were delivered to me just before I left Boston. I had no idea it would make me a target. Francis helped her mount his horse, mind racing. The alternative route to Henderson Station would take them through rougher terrain, adding hours to their journey. They would not reach the settlement before nightfall. As they rode, Francis felt Abigail's arms tighten around his waist each time they navigated a particularly steep or narrow passage. Despite the danger they faced, he found himself increasingly aware of her presence, the scent of her hair, the warmth of her body against his back, the trust she placed in him to keep her safe. It was that trust that unsettled him most. For years, he'd avoided precisely this kind of responsibility for another person's well-being. Yet here he was, risking his life for a woman he'd known less than 2 days. The sun was low on the horizon when they reached a rocky outcropping overlooking a small valley. Francis reined in his horse, scanning the terrain below. We won't make Henderson Station tonight, he said, turning slightly to address Abigail. There's an abandoned line shack about 2 miles ahead where we can shelter until morning. She nodded against his shoulder, clearly exhausted from the hard ride. Do you think those men are still following us? Almost certainly, Francis replied honestly. But they'll have a harder time tracking us now that we're off the main trail. The line shack was little more than a crude shelter, 4 walls and a roof, with a stone fireplace and a single window covered by a weathered shutter. Francis had discovered it during his first year in the territory and occasionally used it when hunting in the area. He helped Abigail dismount, both of them stiff from hours in the saddle. While she stretched her legs, Francis tended to his horse, removing the saddle and bridle before securing the animal in a small lean-to attached to the shack. Inside, the shelter was dusty but sound. Francis quickly built a small fire, careful to keep it low so the smoke wouldn't give away their position. We should be safe here for the night, he told Abigail, who had sunk onto a rough wooden bench, the carpetbag still clutched in her hands. Try to get some rest, I'll keep watch. She looked up at him, firelight casting shadows across her face. You need rest too. I'm fine, he insisted. Abigail set the carpetbag aside and stood, moving to stand before him. You've been riding all day, protecting me, guiding us through impossible terrain. You're exhausted. She was close enough now that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, the smudge of dirt on her cheek. Something in his chest constricted painfully. I can't rest until I know you're safe, he admitted. Abigail's expression softened. We can take turns, wake me in a few hours and I'll watch while you sleep. Francis wanted to refuse, to insist that he alone should bear the burden of their safety. But the weariness in his bones and the clear determination in her eyes convinced him. All right, he agreed reluctantly, a few hours. With the limited space available, they were forced to sleep close to one another near the fire. Francis gave Abigail his jacket to use as a pillow, then positioned himself between her and the door, revolver at his side. As she settled down to sleep, Abigail turned her face toward him. Thank you, Francis, she murmured, her voice thick with approaching slumber, for everything. He didn't respond, but in the darkness, he allowed himself to watch her features relax into sleep. Something sharp and painful twisted in his chest, a longing he hadn't permitted himself to feel in years. The night passed without incident. True to his word, Francis woke Abigail for her watch, though he slept lightly, waking at every small sound. By dawn, they were both alert and ready to continue their journey. It's about 4 hours to Henderson Station if we push hard, Francis explained as they prepared to leave. Stay close to me and if there's trouble. I know, Abigail interrupted with a small smile. Do exactly as you say. Something about her confidence in him, her unwavering trust despite the danger they faced, stirred emotions Francis had long suppressed. He turned away quickly, focusing on saddling the horse. They had been riding for less than an hour when the ambush came. The 3 men from the previous day, plus 2 others, emerged from behind a rocky ridge blocking the narrow pass ahead. "End of the line," the scarred leader called, rifle aimed squarely at Francis's chest. "Hand over the woman and the bag and we might let you walk away." Francis felt Abigail's arms tighten around his waist. His mind raced, assessing their options. The pass was too narrow to turn around quickly and there was no cover nearby. "If I surrender," Abigail whispered against his back, "they might let you go." "Not a chance," Francis growled, reaching for his revolver. What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion and sound. The scarred man fired, the bullet whistling past Francis's ear. Francis returned fire, striking one of the other riders in the shoulder. The horse reared in panic, throwing its wounded rider and creating momentary confusion. Taking advantage of the chaos, Francis wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, heading back the way they had come. Bullets whizzed past them as the remaining men gave chase. "Hold on," Francis shouted, guiding his horse off the trail and into the dense underbrush. Branches whipped at their faces as they crashed through the foliage, but Francis knew these woods better than their pursuers. If they could reach the river, they might have a chance. The thunder of hooves behind them grew louder. Francis pushed his horse harder, feeling the animal's muscles strain beneath them. Abigail clung to him, her face pressed against his back. Then, disaster, Francis's horse stumbled on the uneven ground, nearly sending them both flying. The animal recovered, but the momentary delay was enough for their pursuers to close the gap. A rifle shot cracked the air and Francis felt a searing pain across his upper arm. He gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out. Another shot and their horse faltered, wounded in the flank. "We have to run," Francis shouted, pulling the horse to a stop and practically dragging Abigail from its back. "The river's just ahead, go." They sprinted through the trees, the carpetbag clutched in Abigail's hand. Francis could hear their pursuers dismounting, cursing as they followed on foot. The roar of the river grew louder. When they burst from the tree line, Francis saw with dismay that the recent rains had swollen the waterway into a churning torrent. "We'll never make it across," Abigail gasped, staring at the rushing water. A bullet splintered bark from a tree beside them. They were out of options. "We have to try," Francis insisted, taking her hand. "The current will carry us downstream. If we can reach the far side, we might lose them." Abigail looked from the raging river to his face, then nodded resolutely. "Together, then." They plunged into the icy water hand in hand, the current immediately sweeping them downstream. Francis fought to keep his head above water, never releasing his grip on Abigail's hand. The carpetbag was gone, torn from her grasp by the force of the river. The cold was numbing, the current relentless. Francis caught glimpses of their pursuers running along the bank, firing ineffectually into the water. Then a submerged log struck him in the side, and darkness claimed him. He woke to the sensation of warmth on his face and the sound of someone softly calling his name. Francis opened his eyes to find Abigail leaning over him, her wet hair framing her face like a golden halo. "Thank God," she breathed, relief washing over her features. "I thought I'd lost you." Francis struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in his side and arm. They were on a muddy bank, the river flowing more calmly several yards away. His clothes were damp but not soaking. He must have been unconscious for some time. "The men," he asked hoarsely, "gone, I think, or at least not close." Abigail helped him lean against a tree trunk. "The river carried us a long way downstream." Francis took stock of their situation. His revolver was miraculously still in its holster, though wet. His arm was bleeding where the bullet had grazed him, and his side was badly bruised from the log, but nothing seemed broken. "The carpetbag," he remembered suddenly, "your uncle's deed." Abigail shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "Lost to the river, but it doesn't matter, not compared to our lives." Francis stared at her in disbelief. "Everything you came for, everything those men were willing to kill for." "Isn't worth your life," she finished firmly, "or mine." Something in her words, in the intensity of her gaze, made Francis's breath catch. He reached up without thinking, brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. "We need to keep moving," he said softly. "Can you walk?" Abigail nodded. "I'm not the one who was knocked unconscious." With her help, Francis got to his feet. He oriented himself by the sun, determining they were still east of Henderson Station but considerably south of where they had entered the river. If we follow the river downstream, he explained, we should reach Miller's Crossing by nightfall. From there, it's an easy journey to Henderson Station. They walked side by side along the riverbank, moving carefully to conserve their strength. Francis found himself repeatedly glancing at Abigail, marveling at her resilience. She had lost everything she'd come for, nearly drowned in a raging river, yet she maintained a quiet determination that he couldn't help but admire. As the day wore on, Francis felt a shift occurring within him, a softening of the hard shell he'd built around his heart. This woman, with her courage and compassion, had somehow worked her way past his defenses in just a few days. They reached Miller's Crossing as the sun dipped below the horizon, a small settlement consisting of a trading post, a stable, and a handful of cabins. The proprietor of the trading post, a grizzled old-timer named Miller himself, recognized Francis and offered them shelter for the night. "Looks like you two been through hell," the old man observed, eyeing their bedraggled appearance. "Something like that," Francis agreed, accepting the offer of dry clothes and a hot meal with gratitude. That night in the small back room Miller had provided, Francis found himself unable to sleep. His side ached and his thoughts kept returning to Abigail, sleeping peacefully on a cot across the room. Tomorrow they would reach Henderson Station and he would return to his solitary existence at his cabin. The thought, which would have brought comfort just days ago, now filled him with a hollow ache. Morning brought clear skies and an opportunity to send word ahead to Henderson Station. Miller dispatched a young boy who worked at the stable, carrying a message that the new schoolteacher had arrived safely but had encountered trouble on the road. By mid-afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Henderson Station. The settlement was larger than Francis remembered, with new buildings lining the main street and the constant sound of activity from the mine on the hillside above the town. As they approached, Francis felt a growing sense of finality. Their journey was ending. Soon Abigail would begin her new life here, and he would return to his solitude. "Francis," Abigail said softly as they paused on the ridge overlooking the town, "I need to thank you properly for everything you've done." He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "I owe you my life," she insisted, "and I want you to know that these past few days, despite all the danger, have meant something to me. You've meant something to me." Francis felt his chest tighten. "Abigail, you don't have to say anything," she interrupted gently. "I know you believe the frontier is no place for connections. I just wanted you to know that I don't share that belief." Before he could respond, they heard the sound of approaching riders. A group of men from Henderson Station had spotted them and were riding up to meet them, led by a distinguished-looking older man with silver hair. "Uncle Jacob," Abigail called, her face lighting up with surprise and joy. The older man dismounted with surprising agility for his apparent age and embraced Abigail tightly. "My dear girl," he said, emotion thick in his voice. "When we heard about the trouble on the road, I feared the worst." "I'm fine, Uncle," Abigail assured him. "Thanks to Francis," she turned, drawing him forward. "This is Francis O'Malley. He saved my life multiple times over." Jacob Connors extended his hand to Francis, his grip firm and grateful. "Then I owe you a debt I can never repay, young man." Francis shifted uncomfortably. "No debt, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Jacob disagreed, studying Francis with keen eyes. "And not at such personal risk." He glanced at the blood-stained tear in Francis's sleeve. "You're injured. We must get you both to town immediately." As they rode toward Henderson Station, Jacob explained that he had indeed been ill but was recovering well. The deed Abigail had been carrying was important but not irreplaceable. A duplicate existed in the lawyer's office in town. "The men who pursued us," Francis said, "they knew about the deed." Jacob's expression darkened. "Unfortunately, news of my intention to leave the mine to Abigail reached certain unscrupulous ears. I've already spoken with the sheriff about the matter." In town, they were welcomed warmly. Abigail was shown to the small house that had been prepared for the schoolteacher, while Francis's wound was tended by the local doctor. Jacob insisted he stay at the hotel at Jacob's expense until he was fully recovered. That evening, as Francis sat alone on the hotel's porch, watching the activity in the street below, he found himself thinking about his cabin, how empty it would feel now that he'd experienced Abigail's presence within its walls. "Mind if I join you?" Her voice startled him from his thoughts. Abigail stood beside his chair, wearing a fresh blue dress that complemented her eyes, her blonde hair clean and styled. Francis gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Please." She sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Uncle Jacob tells me the sheriff has already captured 2 of the men who chased us. They were hired by a rival mining company." "Good," Francis nodded. "You'll be safe now." A comfortable silence settled between them. The street lamps were being lit one by one, casting a warm glow over the town. "When do you plan to return to your ranch?" Abigail asked finally. "Tomorrow, if the doctor agrees." Francis kept his eyes on the street, afraid of what she might see in them if he looked at her. So soon, there was something in her voice, disappointment perhaps, that made him turn to face her. "I have livestock to tend to," he explained, "and the wagon wheel to repair so I can bring your belongings here." Abigail nodded, then took a deep breath. "Francis, these past few days have made me question many things. One of which is whether I truly want to live in town, away from the beauty of the open country." Francis stared at her, uncertain where she was leading. "Uncle Jacob has offered me a choice," she continued. "I can teach here as planned, or he's willing to build a school on the outskirts where children from outlying ranches could attend more easily." "Where would this school be?" Francis asked, his heart beginning to race. "That depends," Abigail met his gaze steadily, "on whether a certain rancher might be willing to consider having neighbors, a school perhaps, and a schoolteacher." The implication was clear. Francis felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "Abigail," he began cautiously, "what you're suggesting, the life out there is hard, lonely." "It doesn't have to be lonely," she replied softly. "I've lived alone for years because it's safer. Because caring for someone means risking losing them to this harsh country." "And yet you risked your life repeatedly for a woman you barely knew," Abigail pointed out. "That suggests to me that your heart knows what your head refuses to acknowledge, that some things are worth the risk." Francis stood abruptly, moving to the porch railing. The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. For years he'd told himself that isolation was a choice born of wisdom, when perhaps it had been born of fear all along. "I don't know if I can change," he admitted quietly. Abigail rose and came to stand beside him. "You already have," she placed her hand gently on his arm. "Think about it, that's all I ask." She left him there, staring out at the lamplit street, his mind and heart at war. The following morning, Francis prepared to leave Henderson Station. The doctor had cleared him to travel, though he advised against strenuous activity for another week. Jacob Connors had generously provided supplies and insisted on paying Francis a substantial sum for protecting Abigail, despite Francis's protests. As he mounted his borrowed horse, Francis saw Abigail hurrying toward him from the direction of her house. She carried something in her hands. "You weren't going to say goodbye?" she asked, slightly out of breath. "I'm not good at goodbyes," Francis admitted. Abigail held out what she was carrying, a book, bound in worn leather. "I wanted you to have this. It's a collection of poetry I brought from Boston. Something to keep you company until—" She left the sentence unfinished, the possibility hanging between them. Francis accepted the book, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Thank you." "2 weeks," Abigail said suddenly. "Give me 2 weeks to arrange everything here, and then I'll come to discuss the school location with you, if that's agreeable." Francis looked down at her upturned face, so full of hope and determination. In that moment he could see a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine, one where his cabin wasn't empty, where laughter filled the rooms, where the burden of survival wasn't his alone to bear. "I'll be waiting," he promised. The journey home gave Francis ample time to reflect. Each mile brought both anticipation and anxiety. By the time his cabin came into view, he had made his decision. For the next 2 weeks, Francis threw himself into work despite his healing injuries. He repaired fences, expanded his small garden, and most significantly, began construction on an addition to his cabin, a second room with its own entrance, suitable for a schoolroom. He told himself it was merely practical preparation for the possibility of a school nearby. But in the evenings, as he sat by the fire reading from Abigail's book of poetry, he acknowledged the truth. He was building for a future that included her. On the 15th day, Francis spotted a wagon approaching his property. His heart leaped when he recognized Abigail driving, accompanied by her uncle and several men he didn't know. He met them at the gate, suddenly self-conscious of his work clothes and unshaven face. "Mr. O'Malley," Jacob greeted him warmly. "My niece has been most insistent that we inspect your property as a potential school location." Abigail's eyes found his, a question in them that had nothing to do with schools. "I've taken the liberty of preparing a space," Francis said, gesturing toward the half-finished addition, "if the school committee approves." Jacob and the other men, members of the Henderson Station School Board, Francis learned, examined the site with interest, discussing water access, distance from town, and other practicalities. Abigail, meanwhile, slipped away to stand beside Francis. "You built this," she said softly, "for the school." "For a start," Francis admitted. "It could be expanded if necessary." She studied his face and the schoolteacher. "Where would she live?" Francis swallowed hard. "That depends on what arrangements would be acceptable to her." "I think," Abigail replied carefully, "that she would find any arrangement acceptable as long as it meant not being alone." Before Francis could respond, Jacob returned looking pleased. "The site has potential, Mr. O'Malley. With your permission, we'd like to begin construction immediately. Proper compensation would be arranged, of course." "I'd like to discuss terms," Francis said, finding his voice, "including a proposition of my own." That evening, after the men had returned to town with promises to send builders within the week, Francis and Abigail sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "You surprise me, Francis O'Malley," Abigail said, breaking the comfortable silence. "A man who believes the frontier is no place for connections, offering to house a school on his property." "I'm beginning to think I was wrong about many things," he admitted. Abigail turned to face him fully, including. Francis took a deep breath, including the belief that being alone is safer than risking loss. "These past weeks without you, the cabin felt emptier than it ever has." Hope bloomed in Abigail's eyes. "Does that mean you're considering my uncle's offer? The school position comes with a small stipend and—" "I'm not interested in your uncle's offer," Francis interrupted gently. "Not unless it includes the possibility of something more personal between the schoolteacher and the rancher whose land she'll be using." A slow smile spread across Abigail's face. "I believe that possibility was always part of the arrangement, Mr. O'Malley, at least from the schoolteacher's perspective." Francis reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. "Then I accept, Miss Connors. On one condition." "And what might that be?" "That you understand what you're agreeing to. Life out here isn't easy. There will be hard winters, dry summers, days when everything seems to be working against us. I can't promise luxury or even comfort sometimes." Abigail squeezed his hand. "I'm not asking for luxury, Francis. I'm asking for partnership, for the chance to build something meaningful together, a school, a home. A life." The last light of day caught in her blonde hair, turning it to gold. Francis marveled at how this woman, in just a few short weeks, had dismantled every wall he'd built around his heart. "In that case," he said softly, "I hope you'll stay for dinner, and perhaps, indefinitely." "I'd like that very much," Abigail replied, her smile radiant in the gathering dusk. 3 months later, on a clear autumn day, Francis stood beside Abigail before a small gathering of friends and neighbors. The school building was complete, a sturdy structure adjacent to his expanded cabin. Students would begin attending the following week, children from ranches and farms within a 10-mile radius. But today wasn't about the school. Today was about the promises being exchanged between a cowboy who had once believed love had no place in the frontier and the woman who had proven him wrong. "Do you, Francis O'Malley, take Abigail Connors to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the minister asked. Francis looked into Abigail's eyes, seeing in them the future he'd never dared to imagine. "I do," he answered, his voice steady and sure. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Francis led Abigail away from the crowd, back to the porch of what was now their home. Happy? He asked, drawing her close. Completely, she replied, leaning into his embrace, though I've been wondering something. What's that? Abigail's eyes sparkled with mischief. That first night when I asked if anyone else lived in your cabin and you said no. Did you ever imagine that would change so completely? Francis laughed, a free and joyous sound that would have been unrecognizable to the man he'd been just months ago. Not in my wildest dreams. But then I hadn't met you yet. As the stars appeared one by one above their homestead, Francis O'Malley held his wife close, grateful for the broken wagon wheel that had brought her to his door and the courage she'd given him to believe that even in the wild frontier, a heart could find its home.